So I'll say that we're going to start, before I jump to the next slide, we're going to start with sort of a quick history of Zero Trust, where it came from and sort of how it grew into what it is today. And then we're going to jump into some of the fundamentals of Zero Trust. And then we'll talk about sort of applying those fundamentals to the ecosystem, to how it's evolved over time, et cetera. And I know Tom said at the beginning, but I'll reiterate, this is a very much an open discussion. So you don't need to hold your questions until the end. Please jump in and interrupt us if you want to talk something through. We're happy to do that. So zero trust as a term has actually really been around since the 90s, and it was used in a couple different contexts. But when it finally came into sort of being, you know, around capabilities that we would understand that are more zero trust as we you know, understand the architecture and framework, is around 2010. A gentleman named John Kindervag, he defined the term. He was working for Forrester, later moved on to Palo Alto Networks. But really, when he defined it back then, it was a lot of it was more around network segmentation. So if you've been in IT for at least 10 plus years, you may very well been involved with the early network segmentation projects. It was really part of that trend of trying to stop lateral movement, right? Trying to stop movement across the enterprise and still maintain a very strong, you know, firewall perimeter, right? From there, about a year later, Google started to develop its own zero trust initiative, and they developed something called Beyond Core. And that was a set and a framework of how they were going to design zero trust into their architecture, and they released it publicly so that other organizations could use it as well. You know, mentioned a moment ago, I think Frank mentioned that NIST is working on, and he's helping them working on control sets and standards for zero trust. But really, all the different vendors that are out there, Microsoft, all of the IAM vendors, really are just trying to understand what zero trust is themselves and build products around it. It's not really an official standard, and that may change down the line as organizations coalesce around it. But today, it's not really an official standard. It's more about a group of best practices. The vendors all have their idea of how to deliver zero trust, but just keep in mind that it really is the vendor's approach and context to zero trust with their products. That there's no one standard that everybody's holding to, right? So really, if you look at it the
So
other way,
Jason,
yeah, go ahead, Tom.
so Jason, we won't be zero trust certified after this session.
Yeah, it's not like PCI DSS, right? It's not like SOC 2, right? It's not a certification yet that you really get that says you're zero trust, right? It's a framework. It sort of reminds me, the closest analogy I've seen is sort of like DevOps, right? It's not a single tool. It's not a single thing. It's a framework, and it's also a mindset. And we'll talk about that mindset on the next slide, and the way you design with this mindset that makes it zero trust. All right. So what is zero trust? There's a really long definition at the top of the slide here, and I think it's a really good definition. So if you have a chance to skim that, that would be really great. That's why I included. I also included Department of Defense. The other group that I actually look to a lot for zero trust, if you're keeping any notes on this, is the UK also has their National Cybersecurity Center, and they have a lot of really good advice on zero trust as well. But you know, when people say zero trust, they commonly use the refrain "never trust, always verify." Right? That's sort of the calling card of zero trust, and it is one of the fundamental sort of truths of zero trust. But there are a few others that are related to that, but really are their own things that are worth talking about. Right? Assume a hostile environment when you're building out anything. In your environment in the cloud, assume that it's going to be hostile and design with that hostility in mind, and designed to be resilient against that hostile. Don't just be looking for people trying to breach you. Also look for evidence of breaches. Assume you've been breached at any one time, and that should be the context that you're going after that kind of data. Again, never trust, always verify, which is the idea that every single session that a device or a user or both initiates needs to be verified. And really, before I jump into the scrutinize explicitly, I'd say apply analytics, meaning that you are now taking a lot of that data that before was just sitting in logs or not captured at all, and pulling in that data so that you can then scrutinize explicitly using multiple attributes to figure out who's trying to connect and is it appropriate. We'll talk a little bit about how that's done and really what that means when it's talking about applying policy and different factors and different attributes for authentication. So really, it's all of these together, right? You're always verifying all of the different sessions that are attempting to connect, but you're also designing in the mindset that you're expected to get breached, and you're also looking for breaches as if you already had been, so that you can pick up on anything and learn the lessons and move forward with it. You're also grabbing the data, you're analyzing it, and you're applying it in a way that is actionable with how people are accessing your services. So that's really the whole set and the framework of the ideas that they want you to think about as you're designing here. So make sure I got. All right, I'm sorry, had a computer glitch. Any questions here? So questions to Frank and Matt. You know, these are some pretty high-minded ideals, right? Never trust, always verify, assume a breach, assume a hostile environment. When you go into organizations and you're laying all of this out, what advice are you giving to them? Because how do you make this stuff actionable? I know we'll talk about it down the line, but you know, these aren't just academic statements, right? They're actual things that we want to put in place. So what kind of advice are you giving folks as they're starting out on the journey?
Well, I'll bite. So as you start on your journey, I think the most important thing is to understand your identity debt and your technology debt. You know, if we're assuming a hostile environment, you know, we have to understand what it is we're protecting. If we can't see it, we can't protect it. And we have to know what we're protecting it from and who we're protecting it from. And that also involves understanding the identity. Right. And the identity doesn't have to be a carbon life form. It might be an RPA, it might be a bot, might be a service account, could be a number of different things, could be different personas. And until we, you know, really get a handle on those two things, and most importantly, the data, and where data resides, how data is classified, what does data contain, what's the metadata about the data, you really can't get started with zero trust. So that's usually, you know, from an identity perspective, you know, we will tell them, hey, start off with simple processes like access certifications to understand who currently has access to these systems and should they, and put that responsibility on the business owner and the application owner, not just the security team or the compliance team. So those are some of the simple ways to get started, to just start laying that foundation. Matt, on your side, any different from privileges?
No, I definitely think the same in a lot of those points you made. The thing that I'm thinking about here is really the fact that this argument has already been made for us, right? This was an argument that we were making, you know, around zero, you know, assuming breach and never trust, always verify 2 years ago, right? This was the argument, you know, this group was making to kind of bring up the cause. I think this argument has been made and won, right? And you know, as we were kind of forced outside the perimeter, and the network perimeter really couldn't keep up. We really are in a hostile environment, right? Most of our assets, most of our users are sitting out there on the internet working from home, and they're not in protected barriers.
Right.
I do think the network perimeter has been doing a pretty good job of actually keeping up, right? But when we first saw this thrust of users not being, you know, in the, you know, corporate networks, we really are in a hostile environment.
Mm-hmm.
So the things that we're thinking about, you know, when we're in the network perimeter and kind of this assume breach mindset, and the way that attackers are attacking our environments these days, right? They're tricking users, and they're on our networks, right? So that's really kind of been an argument that I feel like has been won, really, right? So it's just a matter of keeping up and making sure that we're able to implement these technologies around the modern workforce.
No, that's fantastic. That's great input. All right, let's keep rolling. So let's talk about some common challenges that we see when it comes to zero trust. Really, quite honestly, the biggest challenges that we see are a lot of people just don't understand what it is, because it's not an official standard, because it's a set of best practices, and because it's can be pretty technical, right? When you start to get into the nuts and bolts of how it works, a lot of people don't understand it, and they have trouble getting their head around it, which is why we have roundtables like this, right? Also, a lot of business processes that are supported by IT are, aside from those interfaces with IT, at least in my experience, are pretty opaque, right? A lot of times you don't know what the business is doing behind the scenes, and quite often we see an advisory that organizations work around IT and actually do things that are identity related on their own, because it's a lot less friction to just set that up. So the business processes are opaque. It's hard to understand what they are. And honestly, you know, I worked for a technology risk office for a very large organization, 200,000 plus employees, you know, managing the cyber and IM program office and strategy. And what we were constantly told across the organization is we're the group that told everybody no, right? We're the group that stops things from happening because of security concerns. And so there's always an automatic pushback a little when you're talking about more security controls and more checks and verifications. So you have to make sure that you're also selling that with the ways that you can make that as frictionless as possible, or maybe even improve the lives of users. Google actually found that as they went through their Beyond Core initiative, it actually improved the productivity of users because it made getting to resources much more standardized and easy to do, right? So selling those positive benefits is really important. You mentioned earlier, Frank, you were talking about technical debt. That is one of the bullets I capture here because it's a major component, right? Can you describe why is technical debt or legacy technology such a challenge when it comes to IAM?
Yeah, there's a number of factors there. I'd say that the biggest one is a lot of our debt is still disparate. We still have siloed systems. We still have applications, systems, infrastructure that's not connected. And basically that creates blind spots. It creates blind spots in our ability to see who has the access. It creates blind spots in what's happening on those applications and systems. The same thing with the identity debt. We have overexposed resources. We have overexposed entitlements, over-entitled users rather. So the debt that we have, we really need to get our hands around.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I will say, as a company that also integrates, we do a lot of integration work with different IAM products. That's a real challenge, getting all of that integrated and getting it all work together, because legacy applications are not, by definition, they don't have modern architecture. So a lot of new applications, slapping an IDP in front of it or something like that is not a big deal. It's architected for that. Whereas when you're trying to do with legacy tech, there's just nothing there. So that's
the worst case scenario, right? When the technology that you have doesn't even support what you need to do with a strong authentication, a multi-factor, or even authentication at all, right?
That's right.
When we're thinking of some OT applications, we don't even have authentication there sometimes. So it's really challenging to get back to putting modern controls in place when you're dealing with technology that never even saw this coming.
Yeah, so definitely, and it is really, to this entire point to me is a subset of what you said earlier, Frank and Matt, is that the biggest challenge you have is just understanding what's currently there, what's your current state. And really that's the recommended approach. If you notice on the right of the slide there, come to this as a sort of a framework and a roadmap perspective. You're going to have to move a lot of pieces over time in order to really implement zero trust. It's not a thing that you put in. And really, it's about understanding your current state so you can have a realistic picture of where that legacy technical debt is that you have to deal with, and maybe where you're actually in pretty good shape. You just don't know that until you figure that out. And then finally, understand, separate vendors from the hype. But really, it is just making sure that your vision of what zero trust is being matched by what the vendor's vision is. That they're able to deliver on that, rather than their vision of zero trust and what they think it is, or that it's burnt into their products and you have to buy only theirs across the board or something like that. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the evolution of zero trust. I mentioned early on that it really did start out with network segmentation. I'm not sure how many of the folks on the call have been involved with network segmentation projects. They were very difficult, very expensive, at least the ones I was involved with. Quite honestly, I saw many more of them not succeed than I saw succeed. But really the idea was that, stopping lateral movement, putting blockers across the organization so that you had a restricted area that you could operate in should you be able to breach the perimeter, right? From there, it moved on more to, let's look more deeply into the actual devices themselves. Let's look into the systems and let's start doing verification. That's when you started seeing things like PKI products coming out and certificate-based authentication and all of those different products that came out. That was really starting to come out in that time. And really those have started to mature. Again, I've seen companies that have tried to put some of that in and had trouble. But people are maturing down that line. And now it's really moved to identity. And probably the most common cliched term you'll hear around identity. Identity is the new perimeter. And it's a cliche because people say it a lot, and people say it a lot because it's true. So here's here's my question to you, Matt, and then maybe Frank. How is identity the new perimeter? Do you agree with that statement? Is that totally true? Do you think there's some little tweaks to that? What are your thoughts on that use statement a lot of identity as the new perimeter?
Identity is a forgotten perimeter, right?
Yeah.
It's a perimeter that's always been there, but we really haven't been utilizing very successfully. We kind of saw these early implementations of zero trust around, the network and network segmentation and just how difficult it is. Well, it's pretty difficult to do a PAM program, but it's a lot easier than managing, every single device's communication to every other device. It's a lot easier to do that. So it's certainly the current perimeter, I'll say, but I don't think it's new, right? It's just a perimeter that we've forgotten about and underutilized over time and are really coming back to it.
Yeah.
And I think, as we move forward, we're starting to blend a lot of these things back in. A lot of these different elements are just different authorization, right? To give you a better understanding of the risk picture. So I definitely believe in, the fact that identity is the perimeter of the future, but I don't know if it's new.
Sure. That's a good point. Frank?
Yeah, and Matt, I think you nailed that. It's been a marketing term, and it's funny you said that, Jason. SailPoint's been using that as a marketing term for a few years now. We had a whole identity as the new perimeter campaign a while back, and I think any identity practitioner will say we've been doing a lot of the principles of zero trust for quite some time. Least privilege based on identity, right? It has to be context aware. We've been talking about contextual, dynamic provisioning based on attributes and text and context, right? We've been doing that for quite some time. Automation. We've been automating workflows and provisioning for quite some time. Just and continuously evaluating access from an identity perspective. Identity vendors have been doing that for a long time. I think what's really made identity the new perimeter is, look at it this way: the perimeter itself, the network, the firewall, the VPN. We're assuming those have been breached. So where do we fall back to? That next bastion point is the identity, and that's what's being attacked. So we have to make identity the new perimeter. And I think that's why in the past, 2-3 years, it's become a more common term. It's become an accepted term. And I think you're going to get there, and I won't steal your thunder about MFA and SSO, but before we even go there, we need to protect the identity itself from being breached. I mean, we are the target. So let's go continue down that journey.
Now that's a great comment. I will say the bullet below on number 3 there, identity and access at the center of security. I'll say that another way. I would say any security architecture or strategy or roadmap that doesn't have identity and access at the center of it is not a security roadmap and strategy, right? It just can't be without that today, because as you both have said, the perimeter is basically gone and everybody's out in the wild, right? That's really where the security has to live at. Certainly you need to do perimeter security. Nothing in zero trust says that that's not important, right? But it's saying that identity and access really needs to be the center, because that's how the interactions are happening. And talking about adaptive authentication like MFA, 2FA, whatever you want to call it, really is the type of stuff they're talking about, right? Multiple attribute verification. Looking at things like where the user's coming from, what device they're on. Have we seen that device before? Is it coming from a location that we've seen before? Is it coming at a time of night that they've never logged on before? And then using that to make risk-based decisions on whether or not to let that device and user in. Is adaptive authentication, and that's really come up as a strong way to just quickly power up your environment and put safeguards around it that aren't there today and really help. So that's why it's called out there. We've also learned a lot from the SolarWinds hack, and really the big learn here is that we need to verify here as well. Secure coding and building security into code certainly isn't a new thing either, but there needs to be a renewed focus on it. So that's become part of the stack as well. And then really 5 to me is all about analytics. Are we pulling everything into view together? Are we making sure everybody has the integrated view and the understanding of what zero trust is? Are we assuming a breach? Are we designing around a hostile environment? Are we ensuring that the identities are the perimeter around the identity is protected well with good controls and good tools, right? That's the integrated view altogether. So that's the flow we've seen over time, how zero trust has really gone from more of a network focus to more of a identity and access centric integrated view of what's going on in your environment and with your users that when they're not in your environment, right? Okay. So building blocks for zero trust, really, if you break apart sort of the stack of all the different areas that typically, zero trust applies to, when it comes to the identity management of the user, turning on MFA, all those things that I just talked about. When you jump over to network, any communication is encrypted and authenticated. All of those are different areas that you can focus on, and those really are the pieces of the puzzle that make up the entire architecture that we'll dive into in any minute. I will say that the red light, green light that shows how easy it is to do, part of the reason why is a comments that Frank and Matt made earlier, right? This is not new. We've been designing these solutions for a long time and designing these best practices for a long time. They're understood. And because of that, we understand what it takes to put them in and make them successful as implementers and as vendors of these products, right? The other environments, not necessarily so much, right? Network segmentation is really tough. Setting up full encryption across the entire network is tough, right? So it does make sense to focus on users. It does make sense to focus on that context, but also users and identities really roll across all of these, right? So if you think about all the different areas, I mean, Frank, if you were looking at this list, I mean, user and identity is on the left there, but I would see it flowing across all these areas. Would you agree?
Absolutely. There's a piece of identity or relationship in each one of the building blocks. It probably is the only one that goes across all.
Right.
When we think of the relationship between the identity and a device, you mentioned the relationship between the identity and the network. Obviously, there's a strong relationship between the system, app, and data and the identity itself.
Yeah,
so absolutely, it goes across.
So really securing users really does secure the other areas more as well.
And I think it's more complicated. I think it gets even more complicated than that, right? Because, if you think of device and network as different contextual validations that we can use, and then we think of system, apps, and data as the risk level, right? That can kind of reverse impact which one of those elements needs to line up for that user, that identity, to be able to interact with that data on the end. Right. So I think they're very intertwined, right? And
Yep.
Different risk data on the right side could impact, what you need to do from a user verification standpoint. So I think they're very intertwined, right? So I as a, kind of an identity security, engineer, I really think of everything flowing through that identity with all these pieces very interrelated instead of, separate individual pieces.
That's great. That's great. Awesome. So I will say before we jump into a little bit more of the sort of the architecture, and we'll also talk a bit about the common solutions that are used in Zero Trust, I wanted to keep these three things in mind. First of all, I mentioned it before, it really must benefit the business. And I say that in two different ways, right? You really can deploy workflows and processes that make users' life easier yet still secures their identity, right? Things like MFA, things like adaptive access control, things like easy tools for workflows for resetting passwords or doing other identity related tasks, right? There's a lot of ways you can make their life easier, but there's also ways that for the leaders of the company that you can show that you're reducing risk and making sure that the level that you're investing in zero trust really is to bring the company to the risk level that they're comfortable with, right? There's a number between zero and infinite that's the right investment number for implementing zero trust principles across your environment, and that number really is the level of risk your leaders and the organization want to take, right? So understanding what that is, giving them that benefit so that they can gauge the investment right is very important. Again, it reduces the reliance on your perimeter security. There'll never be a security person around that thinks that perimeter security isn't important, but it reduces that reliance on it by putting the perimeter around every individual user and identity, right? And keep in mind that it's a journey, right? Not everybody's gonna achieve it. You can certainly adopt different parts of it that make sense for you and are appropriate for your organization. And that's the thing to keep in mind. It's a pretty large framework of different things that you can do, and not everybody can do all of them. So pick the ones that work best for you, and just by those alone, you'll reduce your risk and improve business users' function. Okay. Anything to add there, Matt and Frank?
I would just say that was a very key point you made about not everyone will get to full zero trust. It's absolutely 100% correct. This is a concept. It's a paradigm shift in the way we're looking at security. There is no zero trust blueprint that you can go buy off the shelf. You have to mold whatever it is for your organization based on the principles. And that's kind of what NIST is trying to do, is come up with, a referenceable architecture that can be consumed and modified and based on, concepts that work, that, based on 7 tenets that can then be applied to an organization. Mm-hmm. They're not defining a standard. They're defining really a consumption model, right? So I think that's the biggest takeaway from this, is that there is no silver bullet here. And it's going to zero trust at agency or, enterprise A is going to look different from zero trust at enterprise B.
Right.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. Zero trust has got a bad slogan. Right. I think people look at it as maybe overly complicated when, a lot of organizations are already headed in that direction anyway. Right. But yeah, I definitely believe there must be benefit for the entire business, right? Not just the security teams, right? The identity teams. So, doing things to make life easier and reducing friction for users needs to be a part of it. Because honestly, taking those friction points from humans is how we're going to be more secure, right? Because the humans are the ones that are repeatedly being tripped. So if you can give out your password, you're going to give out your password, right? Just like phishing. It's easy. People are duped because they're clicking a link. If you had to type a URL in for a phishing email to work, nobody would be tricked, right? It's just easy. Same thing with MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication. users can be the less friction, actually, the more likely they will be tricked, right? So multi-factor authentication in itself isn't even, the silver bullet, right? People respond to push notifications even if they didn't initiate them. So there needs to be a framework around it, right? We need to use, all the things that we've been talking about for a while, right? Principles of least privilege, and reducing, the rights that a user has, and all that's a part of it. I think passwordless authentication is a big thing, right? I think it's a fantastic direction. I was just looking at my desk at, the passwordless options that we have. I think, we're taking the risk out of the user's hands, right? And we're placing it in something that we have rather than something that we know. I think is a big, a huge benefit. We'll see a huge benefit there.
Yeah, passwordless, absolutely. It's one of the easiest sells ever. We'll make it so you don't need a password anymore, which is the bane of everybody's existence.
I've been showing a usernameless demo lately, and it's phenomenal because I don't have to type things in my demo environment and fat finger even the username. It's really nice, right? Being able to reduce the amount of input that you're putting in to be able to identify yourself.
That's really great. Awesome. Good stuff. All right, so let's talk for a second about zero trust architecture. Really, since it touches everything, it really is as simple as that, right? The zero trust architecture components really touch network security, IAM, endpoint security, really the entire gambit, right? But what I want to zoom in on is really more around IAM in particular, and sort of talk about the different areas. Matt, you made a good point, and Frank, you also made the point that there's no such thing as a silver bullet. But I wanted to talk through each of these items just to get your guys. I'll ask questions about your take on them and et cetera. Also, I'll bring up just-in-time provisioning. We'll talk about that for a minute too, just so everybody can hear what that's all about. So we talked about multi-factor authentication. Certainly not a silver bullet like was mentioned, but it certainly does help in a lot of ways with making it so that you have more than one factor for a user, so that you're making sure that you're adding policy decisions to their access, right, to their authentication, right? Where usually multi-factor is tied in with other risk-based access and a lot of tools that are out there. So you turn on multi-factor, and you can also turn on conditional access that has things like location, time, IP address range, what country it's coming from, et cetera. Making sure that you're provisioning in an automated and timely fashion, and also deprovisioning that access, and really governance of identities. And when we're talking about governance of identities, we're really talking about making sure that policies applied uniformly across identities. So when decisions are made by leaders, that they're applied, as prescribed and consistently. Also capturing decisions that have been made about identities and access. So when people request access, that approval flow is captured, and also certification of access. So really those items right there: multi-factor, risk-based access, making sure you timely provision and deprovision, and make sure you govern accesses. Those to me are super duper linchpins when it comes to identity and access management and their approach to zero trust. So Frank, Matt, your thoughts on that, on those particular pieces? Do you agree with that? Or are there other areas that you would put as bullet points?
All extremely important, right? And I think when you think about some of those pieces, right, the pieces that SailPoint does exceptionally well, and you overlay that with privileged access, that is where really where the beautiful thing is, right? We must control the entitlements that users have, and we must do it on a regular basis. We need process to do that, right? As humans, we're gonna snowball, right? The rights are just gonna snowball. So bringing that back under control on a regular basis is extremely important.
What do you think? Sorry, go ahead, Frank. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say it's critical that we look at our hybrid environment, and we treat as Matt said, that relationship between the identity, the privileges, and entitlements needs to be centralized, right? But for all things, just because we're talking about a SaaS application or a cloud infrastructure or an Oracle database sitting in the data center, the access, the processes, all of the visibility should all follow those same processes.
Right.
Because otherwise, if it's, we're making it harder for one way, easier for another, we're going to be, forcing people to do, abnormal acts to gain access.
Right.
And, the proliferation of cloud infrastructure is also the opportunity for new silos to be developed for the things we've been spending years to take down. So we have to include all that, those governance controls across the board.
That's great. So when talking about governance, that bottom future trend, data governance, I know you have familiarity with data governance, Frank. Can you talk a moment about what that means from a IAM future trend perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely critical, because just like, when I was talking about the technology debt in the beginning, part of that is, data sprawl, right? And especially, just like we talked about the cloud silos of identities, hey, now we're talking about moving our data to the cloud as well. You pay a premium for data, for cloud storage. So as we're, when we look at our data, should we be putting this data in the cloud, moving and paying for it, if it hasn't been touched in 5 years or 10 years, based on retention policy, whatever. But the data governance process needs to go in and look at where the data lives, where the data, who's accessing the data, who owns the data, what the metadata of the data is. And that's how we build those control policies. And map those to the same context of the identity, right? So data governance, I don't think it's got its seat at the table yet. I think we're going to see a surge as zero trust matures. There already is a huge requirement for data governance. I just read an article today, the chief data officer for the Navy, big news. Navy has a huge data duplication problem. Everyone does. It's from taking these subsets of data and moving them all across the environment and cleaning that up. I think every organization, large, small, is going to have an issue cleaning up their data for zero trust.
Yeah, I'll tell you as a sort of an anecdotal trend, doing advisory, I've been managing advisory now for 4 years at Integral. And when I initially did advisory, I would bring up data governance, and for the first couple of years, most organizations really weren't that interested in the topic. And for the last couple of years, they have been. So that absolutely is a future trend, thinking about sort of unstructured data, where it lives across your organization, how you're managing access and control to that. And quite honestly, where they typically find things like spreadsheets with stored passwords, when they do pen tests and things like that, how are you monitoring that, and how are you managing access to that data? That's a future trend. Another one, certainly, that many of you probably have heard of, just-in-time provisioning, or JIT provisioning. Also, one you'll hear coming up is a concept called zero standing privilege, or ZSP. Matt, can you break down those concepts, sort of talk about what they are? I think you're pretty well qualified for that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way that operational access is going, right?
Right.
In sort of being provisioned on demand. And really what it is it's a reduction of the attack surface, right? That's the basis, right? We want to reduce the attack surface by just having accounts that have a default expiration of privilege grant, right? Of whatever that privilege is. And that's really the only difference, right? It's a predetermined point that the rights will roll off that particular account, rather than giving the rights and then maybe recertifying. It's a predetermination that, hey, when we give this account privileges, it's automatically going to roll off at a certain point. And that's really the foundation. And a lot of the just-in-time or zero standing privilege concept is really born out of the shift to the cloud. As we go into the cloud, and we have all these benefits of elasticity, we start to think about ephemeral systems, right? Your EC2 instance is only up when you need it, right? When you need that extra horsepower. So why would an account exist longer than that? Right. We still, the idea of single sign-on and federation are still great concepts, but why would an account need access to a system, for long-term, or multiple systems for long-term?
Right.
That's really the idea of zero trust, or just-in-time rather, and it's all about reducing the attack surface. It's really the way that all operational access is headed, right? We'll still have accounts that have standing privilege, right? There's no doubt there. There needs to be existing points of trust, right? For the provisioning for just-in-time access, there needs to be some level of trust there. There's always going to be service IDs, built-in accounts, break glass IDs. But I think in the near future, the majority of operational day-to-day access is going to be provisioned on the fly.
That's fascinating. That's the trend I see it going as well. And I promise we didn't talk before about that particular part. So, but absolutely.
Yeah, that goes back to the technology debt discussion, though, because those legacy apps that, there's still so many applications that won't support just-in-time provisioning or the dynamic authorization models in zero trust. So, it's so interesting, when we have these conversations, because there are these great things that we can do, but then in reality, when you look at the lion's share of the applications, are they ready to support it? And that's where this becomes a long journey.
Yeah, long journey is right. I will say that it is very common for us to work with clients who have the idea when we go in that 100% of their apps are going to be managed by the time the project's over. And you know what? That's a great vision. Technical debt is often one of the reasons why it's not achievable.
Got to take a risk-based approach, right? That's the only feasible way.
That's what we end up doing. Risk-based approach, regulatory, services and devices first, and things like that. All right, let's move on. So we've been dancing around the different ideas of the different tools that are out there and solutions that are out there, and now I wanted to dive into those a little bit. We often at Integral Partners advise companies to look at it as a tool set of 3 major tools that are in the marketplace. I will say going into this, and I'm guessing that Frank and Matt would agree to me, that there certainly isn't neat boxes that each of the vendors sit in. I could tell you the boxes that they generally sit in, but certainly as they grow out their capabilities, they're starting to creep into the other areas. You know, an IGA company doing some access management, a PAM company doing something around access management, the access management company doing something that's sort of IGA. But generally speaking, we break these down into these main functions. An IGA, or Identity Governance and Administration System, is really what we call the hub of identity, right? This is where your identity lives. If you look at the National Cybersecurity Center, and I referenced that before, the UK policy body, because their comments and pointers are really interesting around how to implement zero trust in their opinion. The very first thing they say is a strong central user identity store, right? That's really what IGA is. Certainly you have user identity stores across your environment in AD, maybe in Azure and different places and applications, but there needs to be a place where those identities are aggregated and can be administered and governed, right? And that's really what an IGA platform is. So super key, and what we often call it when we do advisories, that's really your hub of identity. PAM tools for privileged access are really about so much more than just what we'll jokingly call carbon-based life forms, right? It's service accounts, it's device, it's bots, it's secrets, it's you know, RPA bots that are running in the environment. It's administrators and root accounts and, you know, domain admins and all of those different types of folks living and not living that have privileged access, and all of the tools around how to secure that. PAM tools and IGA tools integrate exceptionally well, and they're getting even better and better as time goes on. That whole idea of the evolution of zero trust, where it gets to the point where you have an integrated view, the centralization or a centralized view is built upon those integrations between the tools. Access management tools is more around the authentication and authorization of a user. So when we've talked about things like single sign-on, MFA, turning on those kinds of functions, federated access, that really all lives in an access management tool. And again, those can be integrated well with IGA and PAM in order to provide really smooth workflows for users and also really apply consistent controls across the tool set because you're managing all three. So by and large, that's the way we described how the ecosystem sits to organizations we work with, and there really are sort of zero trust ideas in each of these that you would implement as you implement the tools. I know for a lot of you this might be review, but any questions around that before I ask a couple questions myself? All right. So here's my first question. To Frank and Matt, whoever wants to take it. Can you describe to me, when I mentioned earlier that the integration between these tools it really gives you some good value? Can you describe to me what that looks like? We're often asked by companies when I do advisory, so you're saying we should connect these tools together. Why would you want to do that, and what does that give me? You know, when you're talking about the integrated view and you're talking about having things more centralized and integrated together, what does that mean from an IAM standpoint? It's a pretty big question.
So, yeah, no. So, you know, on the technical side, you know, it's through our connectors and SCIM and, you know, we've taken the pain out of it. You know, 5 years ago, let's go back maybe 7, 8 years ago. There was no identity platform integrated with a PAM tool.
Right.
At least not like we have today. At one vendor I worked at, we had, you know, poor man's integration is what we called it. And we did Active Directory group mapping in the IGA platform, or in the identity and access management platform to the groups being used by the PAM tool. But now we've taken that burden out. You know, using SCIM, this is now a simple point-click connect. And now we have the ability to put the governance controls in front of the PAM tool that doesn't do governance, right? The PAM tool does what they're really good at, and the identity tool should do what they're really good at. And the user have to worry about that connection between the two. And I think that just, the more these integrations in the identity community, SCIM is just everywhere now. Mm-hmm. The more we integrate and make these processes easier, the more we can integrate and the more control and visibility we can get from from our applications. And you said it when we started. That's the important thing to zero trust, right? Is that visibility and understanding. And I always challenge that to, hey, we need to tie the security ecosystem to it as well, into the SIM and SOAR environment. Not only so we're auditing and monitoring our own tools, but when something occurs outside of our tools, hey, that SIM SOAR environment, user behavior analytics, whatever it might be, can then query us and say, should this guy really be doing it? You know, give the context back. And I think that's where this integration really comes full circle. Matt, I'm sure you got your take on that as well.
I mean, my half jokingly, take on this is, how couldn't you integrate these solutions, right? The value is so tremendous, right? And I think it comes back to consistency, right? How, being able to be consistent across so many disparate environments and platforms, right? And being able to apply those consistent controls to the most dangerous access, right? Which is the privileged access. I say, how could you not integrate these two tools together? Having the granularity to provide, detailed entitlements to be able to do the configuration, but also provide the visibility is huge, right? We want proactive controls, but we also need the visibility in what's out there. Visibility to either, just understand and audit, but also to retract. To retract the rights when they aren't needed. So that's my take on it, right? It's it's a no-brainer to get all these tools integrated. If you've got IGA and you're not focused on your privileged users, you need to, right? It needs to be extended and extended quickly, right? Because that's the pathway that attackers are taking, right? They get in the front door and they're standard access. They trick a standard user typically, and then they're using the privileged highway once they're there. So it's definitely a no-brainer from a technology integration standpoint.
Yeah, I will add, those are great points. I will add, by the way, keep in mind that having IAM tools in place not only helps from a risk, from a security perspective, really from an operational perspective a lot of times too. I'll tell you a couple quick stories. I was working with a fairly large casino in Las Vegas. We were about to kick off advisory when COVID hit, and they had to go from really no remote workers. Culturally, the organization just didn't like the idea of remote workers. Everybody had to come into the office, to about 5,000 corporate workers going remote over a weekend. And quite honestly, I talked her through the process. She was a friend of mine that I'd worked with before that worked there. Talked her through the process, but it just occurred to me over and over how much easier this would be if you had identity systems in place. If you needed to move users, connect to an app, provision them to the application, all of that is just so much incredibly easier when you have a tool that can administer users en masse like that. Same thing goes with PAM. I was working at that large healthcare organization where the CEO was let go, and it wasn't the greatest of circumstances, and we had a sort of a scare fire drill. We had to go around and change the root passwords on all the infrastructure, all of our edge routers, everything, because he knew all those passwords. And if we'd had a PAM tool and we were locking down passwords and we were locking down everything, then that wouldn't have been such a fire drill. So in a lot of ways, these tools, they reduce risk, they help with all that, but certainly part of why you put them in is just the ability to manage users and access in a very automated fashion can really help with operations as well. All right, let me jump into the drivers for zero trust. We talked quite a bit about understanding your current state, and really, I can't say enough about that. I mean, I know most of the people here have read a lot of the different control frameworks, and if you remember, things like CIS and all those, the very first thing they all have on their list is understand what you have, right? And quite honestly, when I go to most organizations, they don't typically understand what they have, right? So figuring out what your current state is, how you're managing these IAM functions today, how you're provisioning, deprovisioning, how users are authenticating, what the processes are, how the lifecycle events, what we call, joiner, mover, leaver, how those are managed across the organization, really understanding that. You simply cannot understand where you're going without understanding where you're starting from, right? Understanding what your key challenges are, what are you trying to accomplish, and what are your business drivers. Those are really the first inputs to an overall strategy, right? Understand what you're trying to accomplish, understand where you're at today. From there, you can start to look at future state. What are the pieces of the overall architecture that we want to improve on in the near term? and how can we apply those to a future state over the next couple of years? Once we understand what the future state is, how do we get from here to there? So designing your roadmap around moving and migrating to new processes and new solutions to help mature your identity and access management posture when it comes to zero trust, and then pulling in various help from different organizations like ours, like the vendors that you decide to use with your journey on IAM, right? So that's really the flow that we follow. Actually, this is the flow we follow when I do advisory, is we actually go through this process with folks, understanding your current state, your drivers, developing a future state and roadmap. So I will say it's easy to describe. It's much easier to describe than it is to do. The question I would ask to Matt and Frank, but it's, I guess I would say the thing to keep in mind really is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so this is, our roadmaps are typically 3 years. And that's simply because trying to guess more than 2 or 3 years is really a fool's errand. But they're a long journey, and you have to keep that in mind. So my questions to Frank and Matt, are there any other things that you would call out as far as starting to pull together your zero trust IAM strategy, or things you want to emphasize that I brought up that you think are worth emphasizing?
I think it's important to know that the road's going to turn on us, right? As we develop that roadmap, things will change. You know, they always do. Whether it's, you know, just the default way that we're, housing applications or some other revolutionary change, right? So I think it's important to be nimble and keep your eyes open, right, to the adapting the world that's sort of changing around us, and making decisions that give us flexibility, right, in the direction that we go with these technology choices. So I think that's my big point here, is that as much as we think we know today, we'll be sure to kind of come to the realization that things have differed, right, from our opinion from it right now. So I think keeping our eyes open to that, and keeping our eyes open to changes that we didn't expect, I think is a big part of this, because really the strategy is just starting to come together, right? And for sure, those different stages that we looked at today are going to change. Maybe not tomorrow, but certainly within 3 years, we'll have different stages, and we'll probably think some of the stages we're looking at now are just the wrong direction. So,
right. No, that's great advice.
My eternal optimism is that we'll find ways that we have been wrong.
Yeah. That's the old saying. You call it pessimistic, I call it realistic. No, but absolutely, it never stays the same. That's the only consistent thing in our world, right? Is change. So totally agree, Frank.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you've done a great job of articulating the drivers throughout this conversation. And one of the key takeaways that I like to leave with everyone is, when we pitch this all the time, when we talk about identity, is that, hey, we need to have stakeholder involvement, right? That this is bigger than just, the IT team or the security team or whoever we're talking to at that point. And when we talk about zero trust, it even gets bigger, right? The team gets bigger. And that is probably, one of the biggest things that needs to be in that strategy for identity. You have your identity strategy, but then, we're talking about changing a lot of things. And those are probably some of the big pitfalls and gotchas that I've seen throughout, is that we're not getting the right people involved early enough. And zero trust decisions could impact the business, right? So without having the business involved in some of these things, in these decisions, it's critical. So, everyone needs to come to the table. And then on the flip side of that is the vendors need to be able to work together as well. And that's one of the things that's kind of impressed me, to be honest with you, is the amount of vendors that are now working together closely, like we do with CyberArk, for example. Years ago, that just didn't happen. Maybe I worked with the wrong vendors, but, when I was at Microsoft, when I was at Oracle, I never spent as much time as I do now with our alliance partners. And in zero trust, that's critical. I mean, you really have to have your vendors do have to work together, and that should be part of the strategy and the decision making process. Is, you know, does vendor A have a relationship with vendor B? Because if not, it's going to be a disaster.
Right.
Because these tools need to be tied together.
Yep. That's a great point. I liked your earlier point too about having the right people at the table. I will tell you that when we do advisory projects, we provide a list of the people that we want to talk to by title. And we know with each organization, they're all different. So we figure out what the right names are and mixes. But quite honestly, every single time we introduce that, they're generally pretty surprised of who we have on the list, because there are so many business people on that list that don't seem like they'd have a stake or really care about identity or anything related to IAM. And quite honestly, a lot of them, when we actually have the interviews with them, come into the meeting wondering why they're there. But by the time the meeting's over and we talk about identity and how it affects them, and we talk about the processes, and we get their feedback, they are very understanding of why they're there. They get it. They're happy that they're engaged. They're happy that their feedback's getting captured, and that the drivers that they see are being captured so we can design around them. And it, quite honestly, it's about half IT, half business that we talk to. And we talk to a lot of people, but that gives you an idea, because you have to get these people
Yep.
and bring them to the table, because they may make an offhanded comment that completely changes your approach, because they have a lot to say and they're not often asked what their opinion is when it comes to identity.